Thank you everyone for joining this webinar, which is focused on the discussion around reforming the subsidy system in Lebanon. During this webinar, we'll go through LIFE's position on reforming subsidies in Lebanon. As a reminder, LIFE released a position in English, French, and Arabic summarizing our position on subsidies. This paper is available on our website. You can always reach out to advocate@lifelebanon.com if you would like to be part of our updates or if you wish to discuss further. After presenting LIFE's position, we'll hear from two of LIFE's friends, Dr. Amer and Dr. Ishac Diwan, who follow the economic situation in Lebanon very closely. We apologize on behalf of Haneen Sayed from the World Bank, who was supposed to join the webinar, but sends her apologies. However, we would like to thank Haneen for her contribution in shaping our thinking around the subsidies. Some administrative points. First, this webinar is not meant to be covered by the media and is therefore off media. Second, please feel to ask questions as the webinar progresses, and I'll try to address as many as I can with our panelists. Before I present our panelists, I would like to discuss LIFE advocacy and pillar, and then also our paper. So LIFE has recently created the advocate pillar. The decision to create advocate pillar underlines LIFE's deep concern about the unprecedented multi-phased crisis Lebanon is going through. Importantly, it is a decision that reflects LIFE's members' strong views that LIFE should do more to advocate for economic reforms. LIFE's advocate pillar aims to channel our collective expertise, resources, and goodwill to influence economic policy making in Lebanon and more broadly support its economic, financial, and social development. As such, we'll activate our many levers to try to push for economic reforms. All LIFE's official position regarding policy in Lebanon will be published through our website and distribution list. As always, we look forward to hearing back from LIFE's members, so please feel free to reach out to me or LIFE Advocate Chair Omar Slim. Again, the email is advocate@lifelebanon.com. So I'll start by summarizing LIFE's view on reforming subsidies in Lebanon. As I mentioned earlier, these views were articulated in a paper recently released by LIFE Advocate Pillar, which you can find on our website. The paper is meant to be a high-level summary of our thinking and the direction we would like to take the narrative towards. It did not address all of the intricacies of reforming subsidies, which we hope to touch upon today. In a nutshell, LIFE believes that the current subsidy system in Lebanon is expensive. It costs more than $3 billion a year or more than 10% of GDP. We can debate the numbers and what those numbers actually mean, but the number is very high by any metric and from any source. The subsidy system is also unsustainable. It contributes to the steady depletion of the central bank available FX reserve, which is currently estimated at around $10 billion and falling fast. This compromises any sort of recovery for the banking deposit or financial restructuring. The system is regressive. 2/3 of subsidy costs are currently directed toward energy-related items which are regressive in nature. For example, a large share of subsidies energy benefits higher groups' income, 80 of whom own motor vehicles. The system is unfair. It uses BDL FX reserve, which represent commercial bank deposit at BDL. This is effectively equivalent to asking depositor to fund the subsidies, which will ultimately lead to a higher form of haircut on deposits. And then finally, it is inefficient and corrupt. It encourages overconsumption and hoarding of subsidies items, including fuel. Importantly, it also encourages wide-scale cross-border smuggling, which are currently estimated to be in the hundreds of millions a year. So LIFE understands how difficult the situation is in Lebanon. The Lebanese are being unfairly squeezed every day. Clearly, we do not take the situation lightly, but it's very important we tackle this issue urgently, as there's no choice anymore but to do so. The current subsidy system should be drastically reformed by 1, substantially reducing the energy-related subsidy, which represent 2/3 of the cost, including those related to EDL. 2, designing the program needs to be realistic in its scope and target the poorer segment of the population. 3, while food and medical-related subsidies can be calibrated, our strong position is that those should remain in place for the foreseeable future to ensure Lebanon food and medical safety and reduce hoarding. 4, gradually shifting towards a targeted, transparent, and more affordable direct cash transfer model under the supervision of the World Bank. It is critical that this program is designed and monitored by the World Bank to ensure its credibility, especially in the context of Lebanon's weak institutions lack of transparency, and high likelihood of corruption. Finally, disbursement needs to be done in USD to ensure no depletion of purchasing power and to make sure the program is not used to fund the gap at BDL. We will now shift to hear from our guest their thoughts on the topic. So let me present Dr. Amer Bisat and Dr. Ishac Diwan. Dr. Amer Bisat is a Managing Director, Portfolio Manager, and Head of Sovereign and Emerging Markets Investments at BlackRock, where he leads a team managing more than $20 billion in government and corporate bonds. Prior to that, he held portfolio management positions at Morgan Stanley and UBS. He was also a senior economist at the IMF, where he helped negotiate high-profile programs with Russia, Ukraine, and Egypt. Dr. Ishac Diwan is a professor at Paris Sciences et Lettres and at the École Nationale Supérieure in Paris. He has held in recent years teaching positions at Columbia University and the Harvard Kennedy School. Relevant to our conversation today, Dr. Diwan spent 25 years at the World Bank, where he held several positions, including country director for several West African countries and regional economist for the Middle East, and worked on several initiatives, including the Attacking Poverty Program. I would like to add that over the last year, I had the opportunity to interact with both Dr. Bisat and Dr. Diwan in different settings, and I have learned a lot from them directly, as well as through all pieces they have written on Lebanon since the crisis started. So I'm very much looking forward to this conversation with them. So to start, the first question, I guess, is what are the risks from not reforming the subsidy system? So from staying in the current status quo. Amer, if you would like to take that.
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much for inviting me, Gerard, and a pleasure and honor to be with Ishac as well. Listen, if you don't mind, I'm going to spend a few minutes at the beginning before I talk about the dangers of not reforming, of trying to contextualize why we are where we are, right? The concept of a subsidy system historically is one which often is a direct result of a plan that is made, usually by governments, to try to provide goods at affordable prices to people who cannot afford it, right? In Lebanon, this has not been the case, right? In Lebanon, instead, this system has emerged in a very haphazard, chaotic way. And I would like to make 3 points here, right? The first point is that this is not just a subsidy crisis, it's an exchange rate crisis. The reason we are where we are is because the exchange rate has depreciated as much as it has. Right? The fact that the now imported goods need to be priced in Lebanese lira to consumers whose wages is in lira at a cost that is 8 times more than it used to be before, is where the crisis is, right? This is coming because of the exchange rate depreciation. It's not a decision of a political choice to make things affordable to people. This has come because the exchange rate has depreciated from 1,500 to wherever the number is right now, right? So I'm making this point to emphasize that the subsidy crisis in Lebanon is part of a macro problem. Let's stabilize the currency. Once we stabilize the currency, this problem becomes more tractable and more managed. This is not happening because we want to subsidize. We were forced into subsidizing because where the currency is. The second point I wanted to make is that this is not just about exchange rate depreciation. It's also about exchange rate availability, right? Sort of just a mental arithmetic. If the dollars were available at an expensive rate, admittedly, and the private sector could buy the dollars at a very, very expensive rate that it is, right? And we needed, as a government, we needed to subsidize it. That's one approach, that's one path. But this is not the path that we're going down. The path we're going down is the private sector cannot have access to the dollars. So we're going to the only source of dollars in the system, which is the central bank. The only provider of dollar liquidity in the system right now is the central bank. They are not the only, but they're the most important source of dollar liquidity. So now we're turning the subsidy problem into a reserves hemorrhage problem as well. And so we're combining these two things together. It's not just a very expensive it's not just an expensive effort, it's also an effort that is leading to the collateral damage of hemorrhaging the few reserves that we still have. And we, as you pointed out, we're now sub $10 billion of usable reserves, and we're losing around $400, $500 million a month. And it's right. So that's the second point. The first point is that it's about exchange rate depreciation. The second point is that this problem is about exchange rate availability. And the third issue that I wanted to raise here is that this is also emerged at this point in such a haphazard, unscientific, unrigorous, chaotic way. The collateral damage of this system as it's emerged are much larger than the benefits that it gets. You summarize it extremely well, Gerard, in the paper, right? It's extremely inefficient, right? 20%, Dr. Nasser Saidi estimates that 20% of the subsidy goes to the people who need it. We're doing this incredibly expensive effort that is costing massive amounts of reserves hemorrhage, and we're only benefiting 20% of the population, right? It's extremely corrupt, right? The amount of corruption, the amount of inefficiency that is emerging from it, it's exacerbating the political imperfections of the country by helping a political class that now is using that as a lever to entrench its power, right? And most important, I don't want to say most importantly, but importantly, it's also extremely unsustainable. It's extremely expensive. We cannot afford it as a nation. At $3 billion a year with a GDP of 20 billion, you're talking about 15 percentage points of GDP. No subsidy system that I know in the world costs that much. So let me stop. Like the point I wanted to make is that this is about something much bigger than the micro targeted subsidy program that I think we should be trying to design if we want to go down that path. This is about a much bigger macro problem that is creating a cancer at this stage that we need to quickly contain. Let me stop there.
Dr. Ishac, Diwan, do you want to add something?
Sure. I mean, first, happy to be with you and with this great panel. You know, this is not the most pleasant topic, but it's a very important one. I'll just stress a few points. You know, the estimates that you cited are that the losses out of this subsidy system is 3 billion or so. In reality, this was estimated a few months ago. Today, it's much higher than that. I mean, basically, this is $5+ billion of imports that people pay at 1,500, while the real exchange rate today is at 15,000. So actually, the cost of the subsidy is close to 5 billion today, and it's rising every day. Now, these reserves are extremely scarce. They are not really reserves, as you said, they are people's deposit money, but they are liquidity. And liquidity is what's really scarce today. We could do a whole lot with this liquidity. Number one, as you said, as Amer said, we could have a safety net. And the risk of this disappearing is that we won't be able to have a safety net once these reserves are exhausted de facto. And so we won't be able to afford that. Other things that we could do with these reserves are stabilize the pound or to allow people to withdraw from their deposits without generating inflation and printing pounds. So just to give you a sense of magnitude I've put those in terms of spending per day. So basically the cost of the subsidy, which is a gift given to those that burn fuel, those subsidies are, the cost of the subsidy is about $15 million a day. 9 million of those every day go to those that burn fuel. The rest goes to drugs and essential goods. Of these 9 million gift from the depositors' money to those that burn fuel, 2 million go to the poor. And perhaps the depositors would love to help those people. They may want to also fund the drugs at subsidized rates and give a gift of their deposits to those drugs. But do they want to subsidize, to give gifts to the rich and to contraband, which together are a big chunk of these 9 million, 7 million. Now, just imagine part of this going to stabilize the foreign exchange market, which is rather small, would make a big difference. So the big risk now is that we would continue this until there is no reserves, and then they will have to disappear, and it would be impossible to actually support the poor who would have lost because they are disappearing. And just to keep in mind, I mean, we've already burned $5 to $7 billion of reserves, and with this much liquidity, we could have actually stabilized the economy without even a fund program, because what's expected of the fund, IMF, is less than that. And we would already be on a rebound. So it's terribly inefficient.
Thank you. That was super helpful. What are your thoughts on the Ministry of Economy plan and the World Bank plan? Can we afford it, the current plan that the World Bank put together and the Ministry of Economy put together?
So we're starting. Maybe I should jump in and start, Gerard. First of all, one has to give them credit, right? I sort of, it's not very popular nowadays to praise the current government, but I want to give them credit, right? The fact that they were quite serious, systematic in terms of thinking of an alternative, recognizing that was unsustainable is something that one has to give them credit for. Having said that, I think there are serious problems with that program. One, conceptually, and we will be talking about it in a second, sort of substituting the subsidy program into a cash transfer program makes perfect sense, and it's consistent with international standards and international best practices. However, the issue right now is on multiple fronts. One, I think the program was too generous and too large, right? In the sense that the cost of it would have gone to a percentage of the population that is larger than what I think is appropriate given the costs that we have, right? They wanted to help 80% of the population. It's not clear to me that number is too large, right? Given that I would love to help 100% of the population, but the reality is there's an affordability issue, A. B, I think the amount of transfers that were implicit in their program were also much larger than the cost that is actually incurred by the population by the removal of the subsidies, assuming we remove it the way, right? I mean, my estimate is that if you remove the subsidies, the population will be hurt to the tune of roughly $1 billion. And instead, we were going to be spending twice as much in the program. Three, the choice of the goods that they wanted to remain, it was very, very curious, right? They wanted to keep pharmaceuticals, makes sense. They're excluding food, strange. And they're keeping ADL, also extremely strange. It's not clear to me why they're doing that. And fourth, and this is a very sort of maybe a technical point, but they're not very explicit about how do we account for the costs, right? They were keeping it in a quasi-fiscal way by shifting the burden onto BDL. I would rather see it as part of the 2021 budget, as opposed to keeping it in this slightly vague, opaque way and throwing all the burden onto BDL. Just accept that this is a fiscal cost and put it on the 2021 budget and make it as part of a broader budget. Let me stop there. And,
I'll just add one point. I totally agree with Amer. I wish BDL was the first problem that's tackled because it's a big problem in the big picture. But on the safety net, I also have difficulties. It's great to start it. We need to start the safety net as soon as possible and improve it over time. But targeting is really important. I mean, this idea that we could just exclude the rich and pay to 80% just throws the baby with the water. It is $50 per head for the poor, may compensate for the removal of the subsidy, but they are poor for other reasons as well. Real wages have collapsed. So it has to be more targeted and more generous. We cannot escape the fact that this program has to be targeted and that administratively they need to tackle this difficulty of targeting and figuring out who are the poorest. Of course, there will be some corruption, but it's unlikely to be as bad as everything that is lost through the subsidy system. And that corruption will have to be eliminated, the system will have to be improved, we'll have to live with a safety net for a while. The whole recovery program is also going to be hurtful, and that's a very necessary instrument to have from the outset.
Yeah, no, it makes sense, but then how would you approach getting to a better system? Like, what would you keep? What would you phase out? Over what time frame would you do it? How would you think about it? Ishac, do you want to go ahead?
Right. I mean, I think that starting with fuels is a good idea because that expenditure is distributed in a very unfair way. I mean, the rich have the big cars. And keeping drugs and essential food on the side is a good idea. That's the government plan. We've already argued that EDL should move first. Now, even the essential food and the drugs, the system has to be improved over time, and the subsidy is not there to stay forever. It's under we stabilize the economy, and a safety net is in place. And ultimately, if some subsidies remain, they should also move to the budget, because now it's an implicit cost paid by depositors. But what remains, when the recovery program is more advanced, should definitely move to the budget.
Amer? If I could add, I completely agree with this. If I would add, I would emphasize the point about transparency, right, and explicit accounting of that cost. I also would emphasize the importance of timelines, right? There's nothing biblical, there's nothing religious against subsidies. Subsidies are, especially in a situation that we're living in right now, it has to be a part of any solution, right? But we need to be very explicit about the timeline and the methodology and the mechanism for eventual removal. The subsidies, and historically, in Lebanon, by the way, but elsewhere as well, have this horrible habit of becoming permanent. And they become, if anything, they increase in size over time. I mean, the fact that sugar beet was subsidized in Lebanon for, I don't know, 40 years when it was clearly it shouldn't be. Same thing with bread and with wheat. Right? So the importance of setting a timeline for the eventual liberalization of the domestic pricing system is something I would emphasize and stress.
On that, you mentioned like other countries, what you've seen. So maybe could you give us a few examples of what you've seen in other countries that makes a good subsidy program, or like a bad subsidy program, and then how they get out of it over time?
Maybe I'll definitely want to hear what Ishac has to say, because he's spent quite a bit of his career working on this. But for me, there are, and now we've touched upon these best practices already, but let me repeat them. Transparency, explicit accounting of the cost, targeting, very much focused on the kinds of goods that you want to subsidize as opposed to a comprehensive generalized one. Targeting socioeconomically, right? So you're not helping people who do not need to be helped, but rather focusing it on the people that you want to be helping directly. Trying to reduce the emphasis on subsidies and switch more into a program of cash transfers. So you allow the prices to be liberal domestically, with the exceptions, right? For fuel, wheat, food products, and try to reduce that list as much as you can. But then if there is an incidence of hit on the population that you want to help, then you provide them with financial resources through a cash transfer system. And you make it temporary, you don't make it permanent. You make sure that over time this gets reduced. It's how you have so much more experience than I am, especially in Africa on this. But
I wouldn't know where to start. There are lots of examples. You need to provide subsidies as a humanitarian gesture when needed. A good example is the way Syrian refugees have been supported in Lebanon. A bad example is when it's used as a political tool. Last years of Mubarak in Egypt is a good example, where energy was subsidized, benefiting mostly the middle class, which he was trying to keep in his camp. And at the height of it, in 2010, for example, the cost of these subsidies was 4 or 5 times higher than health plus education spending together. In Algeria today, subsidies are 25% of GDP. It's a rentier system. Nothing goes to investment and production, just goes to consumption. Keeps the place holding for now, but really without any hope for the future, since the productive system is not being reformed. A good example of how to transform subsidies into something productive is something I worked very closely on in Ethiopia, is the creation of what we call the productive safety net. People come to work in order to earn what they need to survive. And by doing the work, they improve their environment that was completely degraded. Remember the famines of Ethiopia that have totally degraded the northeast of Ethiopia. And so rehabilitating their environment and dealing with the root causes of their poverty. And so we need to quickly, to provide support for humanitarian reasons when needed immediately, but to transform that into something productive that helps people fish and not just eat the fish over time. I think that should be the philosophy.
Yeah, no, makes sense. Before I continue with question, please, I would like to remind everyone, please feel free to use the Q&A button in Zoom to ask any question you would like us to ask our guests. What about the risk of accelerating hyperinflation by removing the subsidies? And then how do you get out of that?
So let me take a stab at this. There's no question about the fact that the removal of the subsidy or the allowing the price system to reflect, to pass through the impact of the exchange rate onto imported goods and passing it through the consumption to the consumer is not inflationary. It's clearly inflationary, right? And the bank estimates that it adds 25 percentage points of inflation. And then on top of that, one has to accept, contrary to what I'm going to be saying in just a second, is that there are second round effects. Right? You start with the hit, right? The exchange rate depreciates, the price of import goods goes up. If you do not subsidize it, quote unquote, you're passing that cost to the population. That's a higher prices, that's an inflation. But what happens often is that there's second round effects, right? In the sense that wages go up as a result of that. And when wages go up, they become inflationary again. There's this concept of inflation expectations as well, which becomes important, where if you as a consumer think prices will continue going in the future, you start, as a trader, you start raising the prices in anticipation of future increases as well. So it becomes, you unanchor, right? So you have a 25 percentage points increase in inflation and then the second round effect. However, and this is where the theoretician in me is going to step in and say, these are one-off in nature. These are one shock, right? That you're not going to have increased inflation forever and ever, right? This is a one-off increase with exchange. The exchange rate depreciates, prices go up. Maybe there's a bit of a second round effect down the road, but that gets limited. That's done, right? We have that shock and we're done. Then eventually inflation goes down, theoretically, back to zero. Prices go up once because the exchange rate depreciates, prices go up and then they stay at that level. So inflation in T plus 2 is zero, right? So it's a one-off shock. Inflation doesn't happen from removals of subsidy. You have a price increase for 1 year, but then eventually the rate of change is zero into the future. The only reason you get inflation, which is a first derivative concept, that prices keep on rising, is because the exchange rate itself keeps on depreciating. Right, so we go back. It's a macro concept. It's about in this case, it's about monetary money supply increasing. It's about the absence of dollars in the system. Okay, I'm being too theoretical. The point I'm making is that subsidy removal does not create hyperinflation. What creates hyperinflation is exchange rate depreciation, and that's a macro concept that we need to be dealing with. Subsidy is a symptom of the problem, not the problem itself.
I'll go further than Amer. Pick it from where you left it. The main cause of inflation today is losing trust in the system, losing trust in the lira. And this is driven by the fact that reserves are falling. And so stopping that fall of reserve, using some reserves to stabilize the lira, which will become possible when that system of supporting the poor become more efficient, we would save funds that can then be used to support the lira, would actually reduce inflation. I would actually argue that a well-planned removal of subsidies, a better use of reserves would actually reduce subsidies, right? Removing subsidies would simply lead to one-shot rise in prices, the loss of confidence in the system, the constant loss of reserves is leading to an exponential rise in inflation, and that needs to be eliminated. Yeah.
What you're hinting both to, I guess, is that the subsidy system alone, reforming it, is not enough. So the question that comes is, what else is needed to stabilize the economy or stop the bleeding, including the macro element you were mentioning, Amer, before?
So I've become a broken record on this, and I apologize for people who've heard me say this before, but there are two steps, right? Step one is what I've been calling the 100-day program. We need something in 3 months immediately, right? Which is the stabilization program. And the stabilization program, the items of it are fairly well understood. I'm not going to be reinventing the wheel here, right? You need liquidity management, sort of tightening of monetary policy. At this point, the core of the problem is this massive amounts of lira injection that is being created for reasons that are complicated, we can get into, but we need to manage that. We need to manage the fiscal implosion. Part of the reasons liquidity is increasing is because the fiscal revenues are imploding, and as a result, there's a huge deficit that's being monetized by BDL. We need to stop the outflow of dollars, right? And the subsidy program is an important part of it. Subsidy reform is important, but that's not the only problem. There's still a lot of speculative buying for dollars that needs to be stopped. So activating capital controls one more time. We need to do it immediately, right? And finally, we need bridge financing. The country at this point needs a flow support, not a huge amounts anymore, given the contraction, right? $3 to $4 billion can float us for a year. We need that money, but the only way we can get that money is through an IMF program, right? So we need to do so within 100 days, if we do a fiscal retrenchment, monetary retrenchment, capital controls with the bridge financing, I think we can stabilize the situation. That's not enough, right? Because that only deals with the flow problem. It doesn't deal with the stock problem. We still have major issues with BDL's balance sheet, the banking system, public finances, obviously the debt. We're not going to deal with that in 100 days, right? But we need a roadmap. We need a clear, transparent roadmap of how we're willing to deal with these problems, with numbers, with plans. And the sooner we do it, because the problem with that stock balance sheet problem is that it's increasing over time. The more the currency is depreciated, the bigger the problem is. The more we lose reserves, the bigger the problem is. So we need to immediately put a roadmap for the solution of these stock problems, which admittedly, it's not going to take 100 days. It probably will take years, a couple of years, but we need to be clear about it. That's what is needed at this stage. I don't know if you disagree.
No, how could I disagree? You said it all. I'd stress that, we don't speak of capital control laws anymore, but this is needed ASAP and it can be done. The draft is there. It could be day one of your 100 days plan. It's needed to attract new liquidity into the system. Who in his right mind send new money now unless it's absolutely needed for consumption? It also would prevent more flight and unfair capital flight. And finally, it would give some roadmap to the use of reserves over time. We're living day to day without thinking of how this could evolve over time. And I would add also what's really missing. There's a lot of thinking about stabilization. I think most Lebanese now understand these complicated financial concepts. What needs to come to the discussion is something I've started with Amer and many other friends, is to actually have a vision also for how Lebanon can get onto a growth path, what kind of future growth we could have, partly because that narrative is super important to give people hope that it can be done. Certainly there is a growth path out there for a productive Lebanon, but also because during the restructuring itself needs to be done in ways to favor this growth path, by doing it, for example, very quickly, because we're losing firms, we're losing skills, people are leaving, and also because the way you want to save, for example, the financial system is in a way to create a new system that can serve productive purposes in the future, as opposed to finance the government.
Yeah, no, makes total sense. I guess from what you're saying, the question that is puzzling a bit is, since the start of the crisis, what has held back the Lebanese policymakers from reforms, whether subsidies or broad reforms?
Big question. I guess we both have been writing about it as well. It is not unique, that it takes time for a particular political structure to adjust to a totally unheard situation. What is perhaps special in Lebanon is that we've been seeing this crisis coming for years, and the political structure was totally unable to stop it, especially in the past 5 years. Now, the current situation is even harder than stopping the train from hitting the wall, which they failed to do. It's dividing enormous losses. These losses at current GDPs are 2-3 times GDP, possibly more. And so this has been difficult. And clearly the sectarian system has made this even more difficult. But at the same time, this is all this lost time is not exactly a chicken game. It's not that each one is waiting for the other to accept the losses. It's just that the system cannot come together to take decisive action. In the meanwhile, the cake is just shrinking. This lost time is extremely costly. And I would dare say even a bad resolution is better than no resolution at this stage.
Amer, anything to add from your side?
So let me add. But by the way, if I want to step back for just a second, if you don't mind, to repeat and stress, and I think I've always thought it was an incredibly good point that this has been pushing a lot, which is that, yes, we need to be thinking of this restructuring as a platform for eventual recovery. But we cannot divorce the two. I cannot emphasize this point, and this has been the leader on emphasizing that point. And we have been doing quite a bit of work on we've been calling it gazing into the future. Like, how do we think about Lebanon 2.0? So this is an incredibly important point. We leave with one thing is, whatever we're doing right now, it should be a step towards the eventual recovery and eventual growth. To your point about why this is not happening right now, I would add to the atomization point that is mentioned, which is that the system is, the problem is so large and the system is so atomized because of sectarian politics that they cannot come together. I would add another argument, which is the regional aspects of it, right? The problem is that we are agents, we're not principals. Our politicians are agents, they're not principals. They're not masters of their own domain. Much of it is reflective of international dynamics. But that, in a sense, is good news in a paradoxical way. There's a silver lining on both of these fronts. One, let's not forget, we have elections next year, right? That could change, at least in an important way, the atomized, that could help create new leadership, a new political narrative that leads, right? And we should start thinking about it right now, right? Because that's how we're going to break the system, is if we create new leadership, and the elections could be the area for it, or the moment for it, and that's only a year and a half away. So that's an important point. The second is why I still think there's a ray of hope right now, is that the world has changed with the election of a Biden administration. And the hope here is that some sort of a regional rapprochement gets created in the next few months to a year, and Lebanon could benefit from it, right? So both on the domestic atomization, hopefully there's a way out through elections, and hopefully through us being hostages for the rest of the world, there's also a way out. So I'm not completely pessimistic. I'm hoping that we have a window opening up for us in the next few months.
And I should add a topic we've written also a lot about with Amer, is that the current status quo, or the current situation of doing nothing, whether it's by design or just it so happened, it does benefit the economic elites. I mean, the haircuts are being taken by people that can't afford but to withdraw at a huge haircut from their deposits to survive. And the big deposits are waiting for a resolution. The problem is slowly getting resolved through doing nothing. What we have to keep in mind is that it would take years to resolve the whole problem the way we're going. However, perhaps the bargaining situation is changing. I mean, people, middle class is so hurt today that compared to a year ago, where everybody was talking of a fair resolution, fair distribution of the losses, today the middle class may accept a plan for unfair distribution, because they're hurting so much in the status quo that doing a little bit better, even if it's an unfair solution, will become acceptable. So that's another piece to the puzzle.
Yeah, and sorry, to follow up a bit, what should the ISG, so the International Support Group members and Lebanon stakeholders, push for specifically, do you think, at this point?
We keep scratching our heads to figure out what good advice to give to external powers, it's very difficult to know at this stage. I mean, the broad kind of roadmap that makes most sense is the one where you have an independent government with special powers to deal with the situation leading to an election. That doesn't seem to be the way things are going. Things seems to be going to have the political parties take their responsibility, form a government, and tackle the resolution of the crisis. Now, that may not be so bad. At least they would be obliged to pay for their mistakes of the past. But it is also risky because they may avoid doing it and lose more time, or they may, not be able to make decisions as in the past, or they may push a lot of the burdens to others. So, still, on balance, any situation any political resolution that leads to a quick resolution would be preferable, I think.
Yeah. Amer, anything to add from your side on that? Okay.
Maybe I'll add two things. I mean, at the same time, it's very important to be focused on the humanitarian aspect of the current situation. Whether it's the Beirut blast, dealing with the COVID crisis, the safety net. So, unfortunately, we have become a humanitarian country. So we have to also push our external partners to take this seriously and to manage the humanitarian effort with the full involvement of civil society and in a very transparent way, so that it is credible and money reaches those that it should reach. And also, some external partners have been supporting the private sector. And our private sector, in spite of this horrendous crisis, some parts of it have shown resilience and are going to be very important for future growth, and they need to be supported to survive. So more imaginative ways of helping them with, for example, trade finance to import inputs and things of that nature are also needed, especially that we could remain in this current uncertain situation for a while.
Yeah. Amer, this one, by the way, that was from our guests, the previous question. Amer, one from our guests also. Do you think all the decline in the BDL reserve in the past few months is explained by subsidies? If not, what are they spending reserves on?
No, they certainly are not. The pace at which reserves are hemorrhaging cannot be explained. Only half of it can be explained by reserves, right? By the direct provision of dollar to help importers. The other half, another 400-500 billion, cannot be explained by that. And there are multiple explanations for why this could have happened, right? One is intervention. There were moments in which they were trying to intervene, in which try to stop the dollar from depreciating. To my mind, haphazardly, inefficiently, and suboptimally, but they tried to do it several times. Another reason is because they were providing, and that was early on, support to domestic financial system to repay its foreign liabilities. So in order to keep the counterparty relationships between banks and their counterparties elsewhere, so they were providing them with dollars. A third, unfortunately, is deposit capital flight. They were also funding capital flight of the kind that should have stopped had we had the capital control early on. So for all these three reasons, that's why reserves keep on. So it's only half is from subsidy, the other half is from reasons, some of which are understandable. Again, you want to keep the banking system's counterparty relationships going on, but some of it is unreasonable and unacceptable. Capital flight, intervention.
Yeah, just to put some numbers on that, it's been roughly $1 billion per month, so $12 billion a year, and half of it.
Half of it is subsidy, and half is coming from other reasons. Exactly.
Yeah. One question from one of our guests: wouldn't removing fuel subsidies add more pressure on the price to commute to and from work for the poor, knowing there's no public transport in Lebanon?
Yes, absolutely. That's why safety net is crucial. The key, I mean, everybody will have to pay more. Some people can afford to pay more to put fuel in their Mercedes, and others should do not afford to pay more, to pay for public transport, to go earn $50 a month at current rates. And those are the ones that need to be supported, not those with a Mercedes.
Yeah.
And probably those with the Mercedes do not even want that subsidies. I mean, as Amer said, it's not even by design.
Yeah. Another question is, looking at other country experiences, many of them fail to lift subsidies transfers to household once their economies rebound. Going forward, I assume this will be an issue for Lebanon. How can a scenario like this be avoided? So basically move from like no subsidies at all.
Yeah, I mean, this. Let me step in here, and again, as has a lot of experience on this one, but from the few times I've worked on this in Russia and Ukraine, Egypt obviously is a good example. What starts off as being temporary almost always becomes permanent. It becomes a vested interest. It becomes something that, and again, not just because the people who want to keep, who benefit from it want to keep it, and they certainly do, to be fair, but because the people who benefit from it, who shouldn't be benefiting, become very powerful, politically very powerful, right? Whether it's the importers, whether it's the intermediary, the smuggler, the political class that benefits from that rent that they start providing right now, which is why tying your hand as a policymaker beforehand with a timetable and a mechanism for removal of the subsidy over the future with well-defined goalposts along the becomes very important. So one approach that I've seen is to have a program that and I've seen this in Mexico being used quite a bit, is to slowly converge domestic prices to international prices over time. So you say on year one, we're willing to accept gasoline prices to be 50% of international prices. In year two, that gap should be 30%. In year three, it should be 10%. And then when we get to zero, you introduce this automatic price stabilization and automatic price. So if international prices goes up by 10%, automatically domestic prices go up by 10%. But importantly, if international prices go down by 10%, you promise the consumer that you will reduce the price by 10%, right? So you make it both up and down, because a lot of these prices are commodity prices as well. So transparency, timetable, tie your hands, and then eventually have an automatic system to keep domestic prices linked to international prices.
You know, I can't avoid here not putting the Iranian example on the table. It's a super interesting example. You know, they had huge subsidies, oil subsidies, energy subsidies, and President Ahmadinejad removed them by distributing the amount of the subsidy directly to the people. And this was hailed as like best practice program in the world. And you know, it was done with a lot of transparency. People had money in their accounts before the subsidy was removed, so there was no demonstration. It was beautifully done. And that direct transfer system has survived. It is still operational today. However, politicians were not able to remove the subsidy system. So actually what we have today is the subsidy system and the safety net, the distribution of the saving from removing the subsidy system. So it's twice more costly. But I would say, you know, theoretically, this is a risk in Lebanon. It's not really a risk. The real risk today is that we will exhaust the reserves and we will have to stop the subsidies and we'll have no funds to fund the safety net. No subsidies and no safety net. That is the risk, unfortunately, for us.
Yeah. Maybe a couple of questions from our guests that are a bit related. One is, what would be the impact on the black market Lebanese lira USD rate from a lifting of the current subsidy system? And then the second one, which is kind of tight, is it the right time to tackle the subsidies problem when the FX fluctuates so much? So there's this fear always of removing it because of the fluctuation of FX.
Sorry, I have a problem. There's a big delay when I unmute myself. I apologize for this. Listen, I mean, in a theoretical sense, the removal of, let's keep it very simple. At this point, you have a demand for dollars, right, in order to buy cheap products and sell them cheaply. And that supply of dollars exists, right? Because the central bank is giving you those dollars, $400 to $500 million. So if you stop that, right? If you stop it and let all the importation go through the black market, through the parallel market, then almost by definition, right? Now that the supply of dollars has come down, the exchange rate is going to appreciate. But I want to emphasize, this is a one-off, right? This is a one-off shock. That we have a one-off increase in the currency up to a certain level that is at equilibrium, and then afterwards, inflation hopefully, or the exchange rate depreciation stops, or because you've taken into account that one-off shock. But this is the key point: you do not do removal of subsidy and the cessation of dollar supply from the central bank alone. You need to marry it to the other parts of the program. You need to tighten monetary policy. You need to tighten fiscal policy. You need to introduce capital controls. You need the IMF money to come in, right? So the currency today, by the way, at 14,000 is quite cheap, right? By any metric, 14,000 is a cheap currency. The currency is already overshot. The lira is undervalued, significantly undervalued, right? So if we allow all the other, if we enter into a more comprehensive stabilization program, even if you stop the supply of dollars from the central bank, which itself is, you're right, it's negative for the currency, the other reasons will bring back the currency to a level of equilibrium that is significantly lower than 14,000. Right? So if you do the, I'm sorry, I'm not being very articulate. The point I'm making here is that, yes, subsidy removal and the cessation of dollar supply could lead to an exchange rate depreciation relative to where we are right now. But if we do everything else I'm talking about, the currency should be appreciating here, and by more than whatever it depreciates from the cessation of dollar supply.
Yeah.
You know, there's an interesting aspect of the question that we didn't focus on is volatility, right? I mean, given that the exchange rate is extremely volatile, if there's no subsidies, all these prices would be extremely volatile. That's a very good point. So the subsidies also stabilizing prices. What I would argue is that instead of spending $9 million a day on stabilizing fuel, if you spend $2 million on the safety net and use $7 million to stabilize the currency directly. I mean, nobody's stabilizing this currency. It's just moving up and down with rumors. And it's a small market. We were told, I mean, if you had 7 million to buy and sell a day, surely that would help stabilize the currency compared to the current situation.
Yeah. So I don't make it a habit to disagree with Ishac, because usually it's a bad mistake to do that. But on this one, on this one, I am all, and this is where my sort of day job, intervention absent a more comprehensive program is like throwing, I'm not going to use the technical, the vulgar term. It's like in the wind, doing something in the wind, right? You're wasting resources, and you're providing the people with a cheap dollar when they're desperately demanding dollars, right? So you're wasting those dollars. So I would rather we do the fundamental aspect, and then once we do everything, right? If there's a need for limited intervention to stabilize the currency and stop the volatility, or be it, absolutely. But it should be a small part of a much bigger project, which is tighter monetary, tighter fiscal, capital controls, IMF. I'm sure you agree, but
yes,
it can't be by itself.
You yourself said it's overshooting, right?
Right. And cheap can get cheaper, right? Overshoot gets, I mean, I've seen it so many times. If you waste money, I'm going to use the term, if you piss in the wind, right. You're literally sort of reducing, you're literally providing an exit strategy to people who are desperate for dollars. And you haven't dealt with the reasons why they're desperate for dollars, which is the lack of confidence. And so I would rather we put
hard to disagree with that. Hard to disagree with that. You're definitely right. But I think a little bit of intervention still makes sense. I mean, we don't really understand. First of all, we need more transparency. We don't really understand kind of months to months what's moving the exchange rate, how much liras is being printed. We know with 1 or 2 months gap. So it could also be that we have kind of massive swings just because it's a small market and people suddenly lose all confidence. Now, if you throw reserves at them and they still have no confidence, they will just take it and not affect the exchange rate much. So definitely you need a dose of credibility. But if you have a certain dose of credibility, then you would need to do a little bit of stabilization as well.
And the IMF has become very much along your lines, which is like, I remember when I first started IMF, intervention was an absolute no-no. But over time, we realized that at the margin, once you get the credibility, you still need an anchor. And in a market that is a liquid, so they've started giving them more leeway for intervention to stabilize the currency. Absolutely.
Two more questions from our guest, I guess, and we'll end this. The first one related to a bit the discussion we're having now is Amer, how can you say the lira is undervalued? How do you value it? And is it not the judgment that is static, assuming the central bank stops printing money?
Yeah, I mean, that's an incredibly complicated question, a very excellent one. And I should be careful when I say undervalued versus overvalued, because it's relative to what, right? So the only point I make when I say undervalued at this stage, I mean the amount of contraction of imports that has occurred already. It suggests suggests to me, and the cheapness of domestic assets, right? So domestic assets are right now, by any metric internationally, against history, are very cheap. The cost of production, right, in an absolute sense, wages have become incredibly cheap, right, relative to what Lebanese offer in terms of a skill set. The amount of import contraction that has happened relative to what we need. So by those more general equilibrium type of metrics, the currency, however, cheap could get cheaper if the supply of lira keeps on increasing at the pace that it is. You're right, right? And if capital flight continues, then no matter how quote unquote cheap the currency is, it could get cheaper if capital flight continues and dollar and speculative demand for dollar and desperate demand for dollar continues. All I'm saying is that if we bring back, again, I'm repeating myself here in a broken record, if we tighten monetary policy here, we're sure that fiscal is no longer the reason why monetization is occurring. If we're able to contain capital flight, then relative to the costs of production, relative to the level of imports, I mean, the current account today deficit is at $3 billion. I mean, it's on its way to zero. This is a country that's never had that kind of, the currency is by that metric cheap. So if we can deal with the confidence factors, then I see no reason why the dollar doesn't go down.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it will. All I'm saying is if we deal with the macro problems, the currency is already overshot.
I guess jumping to a question related to something you mentioned during the Q&A, knowing the Lebanese context, and if you're trying to help people fish the fish instead of just like getting help constantly, right? Becoming drug addicts in a sense. What would be the 2 or 3 productive areas, to your point before, thinking about the future of Lebanon, that you would suggest that Lebanon can focus on immediately to help people?
You know, for years, Lebanon has only imported and not exported. But in the current situation, there are enormous export opportunities and import substitution. I mean, we're not importing anything now. We need to produce locally a lot of these things. Agriculture, agro-business, small businesses that produce things locally. Medium-sized businesses also that employ people. I think that's how people fish. To help them, you need credit line, you need to stabilize the situation, the currency. I think as soon as we stabilize, we're going to be at a much lower level of income. Maybe 2/3 to half to where we are, but we were. But then the growth opportunities will be there. Because we're much more competitive, and you know, this entrepreneurial spirit is going to be very creatively start lifting us out of this hole in which we are. So basically, help job creation.
Yeah.
Start with agriculture and agribusiness.
Have you seen, based on your experience, both of you at the IMF and the World Bank, and this is the last question, any situation that is as complex as Lebanon?
Well, you know the statistics, right? Triple crises are rare. They are only 2% of the financial crisis, and these are very complex. you add to it the political complexities of Lebanon, and it's a very unique situation. We've also fallen from very high, kind of this Dutch disease situation, in over appreciation, cheap import, in which we were very low and very fast. Now, unfortunately, there are dramatic situations also in other countries where things very quickly deteriorate. Even poor countries. Think of Ethiopia, the way it was, kind of the best students, high growth, just a few years ago, now involved in a civil war. Things can go wrong quickly in many places, but certainly within that list, Lebanon is going to be a case study in the future.
I mean, to me, like, obviously, I completely agree with everything Ishac said. I mean, to me, there are two examples I've been spending a lot of time thinking about. One is obviously Argentina, but I think it's become cliche right now that's the one where we're more similar in terms of level of income, in terms of the nature of the problems. It's also debt, fiscal, balance of payments crisis. It's also created by an exchange rate that became too fixed for too long. That got shocked. But the other case that I've started looking at recently, because of the intractable political in the region, is Georgia. Georgia is an interesting case, which is also a country, small country, upper middle income, very educated, but in a very uncomfortable region as well, with extremely complicated domestic politics. So that's the other place which I've been spending some time looking at.
This is great. Thank you so much, both of you. Really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for attending. We'll end it here, I guess. Thank you very much. This was super helpful.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Gerard.
Thank you. Bye, bye, bye.
Bye-bye.